Hello, my name is Ash, also known as My Name is Mud by Ash. So if you're one of my students, awesome, welcome. This is my first video for you. If you are a friend of one of my students or you're just happening to find me, thank you for joining me. I am gonna do a demonstration on how to get your pottery wheel set up and also to get started with throwing on the pottery wheel. Now, I'm going to throw a lot of information your way, but thankfully that you have a video, you can come back and re-listen to this. So, throwing on the wheel is harder than it looks. I don't say that to intimidate anybody. I say that because I'm a firm believer in the better mentally prepared you are coming in, the higher chances of success with your results will be in the end. So, but like I said, now that you have a video, you can backtrack and rewatch this. So that's going to be really helpful. The reason why throwing on the wheel is harder than it looks is because for several reasons. One, you are learning a lot of muscle coordination, tension, and pressure in your non-dominant arm, which it's not used to, okay? So give yourself some grace to learn and gain that strength. And depending on who you learn from, how they teach, and where you're learning, because every part of the world teaches this differently. So it's really important to have an open mind and learn from different people because, and this is another reason why throwing on the wheel is harder than it looks, everybody throws differently, and you're learning all the little tactics that work best for you. So it is one of those things that's not cookie cutter, and it is really helpful to learn and observe other people because you never know what's just going to help this work better for you, all right? This is all about your body. It's less about the clay. You're basically learning how to intuitively respond to the clay as it responds to you. All right, it's a kinesthetic learning process, which means you learn by doing it, especially in repetition. All right, but even at 20 years of experience like myself, I still have pieces that flop on me. So if that happens, especially if you're a beginner, if you've never done this before, you've only done it a few times, give yourself some grace. And it has nothing to do with your experience level. All right, it happens regardless of how long you've been doing this. So just cut it off, start with a fresh ball of clay, and keep practicing. Now, to get your wheel set up, you need several things. You want about a gallon of water, all right? Whatever kind of temperature water you prefer is what I suggest. Maybe even a second bucket for all of the mud that you're gonna scrape off of your hands as you throw. You mostly want water on your hands and less clay. I'll come back to that because I know it sounds silly, but it is very important. You want a ball of clay that is just over the size of your hands, okay? So basically, your hands don't fully wrap around it, all right? Especially if you're a beginner with this. This is basic or close to a pound, maybe a pound and a half. So if you have larger hands than I do not have large hands, you want to do at least or close to 2 pounds, if not more, depending on the size of your hands. The reason for that is because if you're using a small amount of clay, and you have larger hands, when you start to add tension and pressure through that ball, you're going to get a much significant response, and it's going to be challenging for you to really understand and fine-tune how much tension and pressure you need in your hands, okay? So that makes a huge difference. You also what's called a bat pin. So I don't know if you can tell, but I have 2 bat pins in my wheel head. Those bat pins helpfully secure what's called a bat. A bat is either wood or plastic typically. Plastic ones have a grid system on the back. They all have at least 2 holes, whether they're wood or plastic. Plastics typically have 4, all right? Now, along the perimeter of that plastic bat has several notches sticking out of it. Those notches tell you where your holes are on the underside of that bat. So if there's a single notch, that bat pin hole are narrower. Along the perimeter are 3 other notches. Those 3 notches on each side of each other parallel are wider bat pin holes. Those bat pin holes depend on your wheel head. So standard wheel heads have the wider bat pin holes. If it's a smaller, you'll want the singular notch on the side. So what I typically do is I will put my fingers on those 2 wider bat pin holes aligned with the bat pins on the wheel head. Slide my fingers out. You want that bat secure. If it's wobbly, it's probably either not on fully, so just give it a good push, or it's likely warped. So pay attention to that. It will help you while you get started, because if it is warped, odds are once you pick up wheel speed, it might come off and unattach itself and startle you. Tools I'm going to be using are my wire tool. You always want a sponge. I'm going to use a wooden rib. These come in all different shapes and sizes and medium. So there's wood, there's metal, like this one. There's also polymer or rubber. And some people even make their own out of plastic, which is fun. You can get pretty creative with your rib tools. But I'm going to start with the basics out of a Kemper toolkit. So I'm doing the wire tool, the sponge, the wooden knife, the wooden rib, and the metal rib. You also want a needle tool, which is always handy, and potters never seem to have enough of them, as well as sponges. So always have a needle tool and a sponge for sure. Now, to get started, you want your foot pedal on the preferred side of your wheel, especially if you prefer to have it on the floor. Some people like it on the left-hand side, some people like it on the right-hand side. I think it might depend on whether you're lefty or righty. All right, you have a control box on typically the right-hand side of your wheel with a few toggle switches or maybe even a button that lights up. You want to turn the power on, and now the second toggle switch is the direction of your wheel head, which makes a huge difference, and where one of the significant differences on how people are taught how to throw on the wheel. I am going to teach coning up and down with the first step, which is called centering. Not everybody teaches it, not everybody practices it, but especially overseas, a lot of people throw and teach how to throw using your dominant hand as your dominant. However, here in the US, most people, not everybody, but most people that throw on the wheel teach with your non-dominant arm dominant, which is one of the reasons why throwing on the wheel can be tricky. But this kind of tactic helps to train your non-dominant arm the tension and pressure that it needs to successfully center that ball of clay, which is what the first step to throwing on the wheel is for. Now, with that direction switch, if you're right-handed, you want your wheel head to spin counterclockwise. So you want to acquaint yourself with that foot pedal and pay attention to the direction your wheel head is spinning. If you're left-handed, you can use that toggle switch to change that direction of your wheel head to spin clockwise. A lot of people that are lefty can do well ambidextrous, but I always suggest starting in your comfort zone of spinning clockwise if you're left-handed. My toggle switch is not wanting to cooperate now. So, there we go. All right, I am right-handed, so I'm going to spin counterclockwise. Now, once your bat is anchored, you want your ball of clay. You've acquainted yourself with your foot pedal, and another reason why you want to do that is because to make sure that it transitions speed smoothly, all right? Some of them can be sticky. You can easily loosen that up with a wrench, and some of them can be hypersensitive, so then you might want to make a few adjustments to the pedal of your wheel, because that can make a big difference on your progress. So to anchor your ball of clay, which is what you want to do first after you get everything set up, and make sure your splash pan, which is typically but not always in two parts, is securely on there. They usually snap together. If it's off track when you turn your wheel head on, it'll make an obnoxious noise and rattle. So just make sure that's nice and snug. You want to take your ball of clay, make sure your wheel head is off, and you want to slap it down as close as you can to the center of your bat or your wheel head if you're not using a bat, which is totally fine as well. If you drop it off center like so, and if I turn my wheel head on, as you can tell, trying to put my hands on that ball of clay and keep them on that ball of clay is going to be pretty challenging. So you might as well make that first step, which is the hardest step, easier on yourself, and just turn your wheel head off and slide it as close as you can to the center. It doesn't need to be perfect. That's what the first step to throwing on the wheel is for. But like I said, it is the hardest step, so you might as well work smarter, not harder, and just slide it closer to the center. A lot of people prefer to wear an apron. I typically do, but most definitely I like to have a nice big towel across my lap. I don't always really need an apron unless I'm throwing for a prolonged period of time. But that's one of the many little preferences that you will realize as you start to throw on the pottery wheel. Now, to anchor that ball of clay down, I'm going to get both hands wet in my water bucket, and I'm going to turn my wheel head on a very slow speed. All right, you don't want to have that ball of clay start sliding around or fly off of your wheel. It will startle you. So just a very slow speed, enough that it kicks on. You want your hands completely wet, not just your fingers. You want to place your non-dominant palm on top of that ball of clay and press down firmly without turning that ball into a pancake in the process. All right, you don't want to make it flat and too short, because then the first step is going to make it harder for you to get the hang of. Now I'm going to use my dominant index finger down at the bottom to make a groove or a seal. So I am applying a little bit of pressure down at the bottom. I don't want to see any gaps between that ball of clay and my wheel head. That seal is going to help prevent water from getting up underneath that ball and causing it to slide around or fly off of my wheel, especially once I pick up speed. All right, now I'm going to reach for water, which I'm going to be doing a lot. That water in your bucket is mostly for your hands. It's less for the clay. It's so that the clay is less likely to stick to you and more likely to glide past you. So you always want more water on your hands than you do clay. If you ever get to a point where it feels like you're throwing a dry paste of mud or sandpaper, if you're throwing a stoneware that especially has grog or sand in it, reach for water. You want to keep that ball of clay looking shiny without turning it into a mud pie. All right, so if a little bit of clay flies off or starts to stick to you, just reach for water, scrape that mud off of your hands. You always want more water on your hands than you do clay. Now, I'm going to give this just a little bit more speed. You see how my ball of clay has a clear wobble to it? That means my clay is not centered, and that's exactly what that first step is called. It's the hardest step, like I noted earlier. So exactly how it sounds, it's called centering, and you want to make that ball of clay look uniform all the way around. All right, so in other words, even the most subtlest wobble is still an indicator that it's not fully centered. And the reason why centering is so important is, one, you're trying to work out any air bubbles that's causing it to be off center in the first place. And two, if you open that ball of clay and try and make something successful out of it before it's fully centered, your wall is going to be really thick on one side, and parallel to that point, it's going to be really thin. Now, you can only work with that piece of clay for so long before that thin area in your walls gives out, because it can't support all the weight around it, especially above itself, nor can it support the pressure that you're adding in your fingers to make it taller or wider or narrow, whatever you're trying to make out of it. Eventually it's going to buckle and give out, in which case you're going to have to scrap that piece of clay and start completely over with a fresh ball. All right, so be patient with yourself if you're learning this and new to it. All right, so to center that ball of clay, I want close to a medium speed. All right, it's better to start off slower than faster, because the more you have, the more obnoxious that wobble is going to become, and then it's going to be harder for you to bring it back to center. So for me, I always suggest that you start off with your foot pedal close to parallel to the floor. All right, your heel may be slightly lower if that seems too fast. You want your knees as close as you can get them to that splash pan. That's going to help you out your back a lot. And it's also going to help you maintain tension. Now, tension I'm going to talk a lot about, as well as pressure. You're balancing your wheel speed with those two, okay? So for centering, you need more than what you're used to, especially in your non-dominant arm, which for this tactic of centering, your non-dominant arm is dominant, which is tricky to get used to, or can be. All right, so to help train that non-dominant arm, you want to have equal amounts of tension and pressure in both arms. Now tension equals stillness, and if you can imagine making two really tight closed fists, but with your hands open, that is tension, that's tightness. And the very least you feel it in your arms, if not your whole upper body, if not your whole body. It depends on how much clay you're working with, because the more clay you're working with, the more you need. So, in order to stay still, especially for centering. Then you're gonna match that tension with pressure in your hands, all right? So for centering, that pressure is all in your palms. Over time, the more you do this, you'll slowly start to notice that you'll use a little bit in your fingers for centering. But for now, especially for beginners, leave your fingers out of the equation, and I'll come back to that in a moment. You want to reach for water, make sure your knees are as close as you can get them to your splash pan, and you want to anchor your elbows to your knees or your thighs so that you can supply enough tension to be as still as possible. If your elbows are out here, you're not going to be able to stay still. You're going to wobble with that clay, all right? And a lot of times, for most of you, that clay is going to look like this when you start. So just slide it over, turn your wheel head on, set your wheel speed, get your hands wet, anchor your elbows, plant your hands to the wheel. Now, like I said earlier, your fingers are touching that clay to center, but try to leave your fingers out of the equation, all right? Focus on learning pressure points in your palms, because your palms need to be parallel to one another. Because if they're not and they look something more like this, your odds are you're more than likely just going to push that clay even more off center. Now, from what I've recently learned from one of my students, they were taught how to center like this. I have never seen anybody successfully center with their hands in the shape of a V or an oval. So what I teach is to have your palms parallel. You either want to overlap your fingers completely, or you want to cross your fingers to help you keep them parallel with one another, all right? So, and it'll help you to learn to focus on your palms as well. You want to slowly start to tense up. Now that ball of clay is not going to stop wobbling. You're not doing anything wrong. Slowly tense up your arms. Again, that's like making a tight closed fist, but with your hands open, until you start to feel that clay get a little bit smoother on the side. All right, when you feel that clay get smoother on the side, hold that tension. Don't increase it, just pause. Then you're going to slowly start to apply pressure in your palms, and it's mostly from this muscle up underneath your thumb down to the next corner and over towards your pinky. But really, it is your whole palm. But this is where the majority of it is coming from, is that L in both palms. You're going to slowly start to apply pressure in your palms, bringing them towards one another, but it's not going to look like you're moving. That's how slowly you're moving. All right, so you don't want to go at this with like you're just squeezing it into a turd or something. I don't know what kind of shape that would be, but it's very slow and gradual, whether you're moving your hands, increasing your tension, or increasing your pressure. So a little bit at a time. All right, now that clay is going to start moving up, and that's exactly what you need it to do. When that clay gets to the height of your thumbs, you want to slowly lift both hands up off the wheel, keeping your palms parallel, and you slowly release that pressure to turn that clay into a cone. To emphasize how slow and why you want to move so slow, you want one full revolution of the clay, regardless of what speed you're going, in order to keep that clay uniform all the way around while it spins, all right? You also want to release that pressure so that you don't yank a huge chunk of it off while you're slowly sliding your hands up. If you continue to hold that pressure or increase it, you'll yank a huge chunk of it off, if not the whole thing. So slowly move your hands up and slowly release that pressure, because you're not bringing up nearly as much clay as when you started at the bottom when your hands were anchored to the wheel. Now, this is part 1 of 2 to centering. This is called coning up. Coning down is part 2, and you're going to alternate these a few times until you think that wobble's gone and that clay is centered. So to do that, stay at the same wheel speed, reach for water, make sure your knees are still close to your splash pan. Your non-dominant hand is going to gently support the top of that cone from the side. Don't add pressure and squeeze it. Don't tense up yet. You will in just a moment. You want to use your dominant fist, the muscle on the side of your fist. Now, a lot of people do this a little differently. I prefer a closed fist so that I know I have a little bit of tension locked and I'm less likely to slide around and push that clay off center in the process. What I learned in my experience is if I have a karate chop like this, which is what a lot of people do, it's not wrong, do what works for you. But when I have a karate chop, I'm gonna slide around, okay? If I close my fist, I know I'm locked. A lot of people also use a flat hand on top. What I have discovered with that is, one, you can't see what you're doing or how the clay is responding to you, so that makes this a little bit trickier. The other thing that I've learned about a flat hand on top is you tend to make a mushroom at the top, in which case it's harder for you to learn your non-dominant arm to direct that clay back in. So I suggest locking your dominant fist at the pinnacle of that cone from the radius, so not the full diameter all the way across. All right, so from the center over. So you're gonna hold an angle like this, and you do not want to pivot your wrist. Just hold this stance. Slowly start to apply pressure with your dominant fist. Now, as that clay starts to move down, you're gonna feel that clay want to wobble even more. Your non-dominant arm is going to gradually tense up as both hands move down with that clay. Your dominant fist is going to push down. Your non-dominant is going to slowly tense up to guide that clay into the center. Now, odds are, after one cone up and down, unless you've done this for years like I have, you're still going to have a wobble in that ball of clay, especially down at the bottom where it's anchored to the wheel, because that's the hardest part to center, because it's anchored. It's harder to get to, okay? So you're going to cone up and down several times. So I'm going to do it one more time, but explain it in different words. Reach for water, stay at that same wheel speed. Anchor your knees to your splash pan or close to it. You always want your wheel head on first before you put your hands on that clay, all right? Because if your wheel is off, you get in a position, especially whether you realize it or not, you already have tension in your arms. When you turn that wheel on, odds are you're gonna push that clay off center at least a little bit. So always set your wheel speed first. Make sure your elbows are connected to your body. Anchor your hands to the wheel, either overlap your fingers completely, not just like this, but completely until your palms are parallel, or cross your fingers. You do not have to keep your palms in east and west, which we're already in, right? So left and right, east and west. The reason why I'm noting this is because when I was learning how to do this, I realized that having my non-dominant hand in the southwest or south position, my elbows anchored into my gut, and my gut and my back are helping my entire non-dominant arm maintain and learn that tension that it needs. Okay, so if that helps you, awesome. But just know, regardless of what angle your hands are placed, your palms need to be parallel, all right? Slowly tense up. When you feel or see that clay get a little bit smoother on the side, hold that tension, don't increase it, just pause it. Slowly start to apply pressure at the widest point of that ball of clay, which is typically at the bottom where it's anchored to the wheel. However, when that clay starts to respond to your pressure, you don't want to just keep adding that same amount of pressure in that same area, because eventually you're just going to take that whole ball of clay off. So that brings me back to what I noted at the beginning when I said you're learning how to intuitively respond to the clay as it responds to you. So when you start to add pressure and that clay starts to respond to that pressure, you are then going to adjust your pressure point as that clay follows up. So I'm going to again start pressure right here in both palms at my widest point, which is at the bottom. When that clay starts to respond, the bottom's going to get a little bit narrower. The rest is going to move up a little bit, and now I have a new widest point because that clay is just conforming to the contour, that dip in the center of my palms. So that's my next pressure point, is right in here. So I back off pressure here and lean inwards to apply pressure in the center. The middle of that clay is going to move up, and now that the top has approached this muscle up underneath my thumbs, that's my next pressure point. The top is going to move up. Now that it's completely reached my thumbs, I'm going to slowly lift both hands off the wheel and slowly release my pressure. Now, to cone down, reach for water and stay at that same wheel speed. Your non-dominant hand is going to gently support the top of that cone. You don't want it any lower than that point, because if it is, and your dominant fist is at the pinnacle pushing that clay down, that clay is not supported from the side where you're adding pressure. So make sure both hands are connected. They are always working in tandem, and they are always supporting one another. Now I am applying pressure at the radius, so from the center over with my dominant fist, the muscle on the side of my palm. My non-dominant is slowly increasing tension to stay still and help direct that clay into the center. Until my left, my non-dominant reaches the wheel head. If you develop a flare of clay out here where your hands are anchored to the wheel, scrape that off. It's going to cause your hands to continue to wobble and make it harder for you to center. Now, if you've coned up and down several times and you still have a subtle wobble, especially with a small ball of clay like this or smaller, reach for water, stay at that same wheel speed, but stay in cone down position. This is an alternative to coning up and down, and it also helps you develop tension and pressure in your non-dominant arm. The reason why you also want to know how to cone up and down is a couple of reasons. You're teaching your hands to work in tandem and balance the same tension and pressure in them and move at the same pace as one another, especially for the next few steps. The other reason is, especially if you start to do this regularly, over time, as you develop that muscle memory and you increase how much clay you're working with, the more clay you're working with, the more tension and pressure you need. And the more clay you work with, it's going to be very valuable for you to know how to cone up and down in order to center that huge ball of clay. So that's why I always teach coning up and down. Now, if you're a beginner and you're having a hard time learning coning up and down, in other words, it's that ball of clay is getting more and more off center, or you've coned up and down several times and you still have a wobble, stay in the position of coning down, but all the work is in your non-dominant hands. So my right fist that's nestled on top is not applying pressure to push that clay down. I am slowly pivoting my left, which is my non-dominant. I'm pushing in at the bottom until I make a subtle groove. And that's with this muscle in my left palm. Now I'm going to push down with that muscle up underneath my thumb right here. This is going to help out that last stubborn wobble. It's going to help you train your non-dominant arm. And it's going to work out any air bubbles, if you have any, that are causing that ball of clay to be off center in the first place. That air bubble is going to travel up through that ball, and it's going to come up to the surface and eventually hit your dominant fist. But when that wobble is gone, you want to slowly relax your hands, so relieve that tension and pressure. Slowly remove your hands, reach for water, and slow down your wheel speed just a little bit. You don't want to go too fast for the next step, which is opening, because you're only going to use 1 to 2 fingers to do that. And you don't want to be going too fast and push that clay off center in the process, or accidentally use too much pressure. So slow down just a little bit, reach for water, anchor your elbows, leave your non-dominant hand nestled up against the side of that ball of clay. No tension, no pressure, it's just relaxed. You're gonna use it as an anchor for your dominant thumb. Lock your dominant thumb behind your non-dominant or lock them together, all right, to help stabilize your dominant hand, which is gonna use 1 to 2 fingers to open that ball of clay. You're gonna use the muscle in your fingertip, not the very tip of your finger, so you don't accidentally catch that clay and push it off center in the process. So make sure your hands are locked, your elbows are locked to your body. Use the muscle in your fingertip in the top center of that ball. To get that pull started, slowly push straight down towards the wheel. And as you push your fingers straight down, you're gonna start to form close to a 90-degree angle with the wheel head until you think you're close to the bottom. It's better to be safe than sorry than to go all the way through or really close to it. So when you think you're close to the bottom, just pause. Stop pushing down, hold that position, and then you're gonna slowly push towards you. You're still using that muscle in the tip of your finger, not the very tip of your finger. So, in other words, you don't wanna hook your finger, just hold that position. You are now gonna push that clay very slowly. It's not gonna look like you're moving. You're gonna push that clay towards you until you have a couple inches, so no more than 2 to 3 inches in diameter, especially with a small ball of clay like this. So the reason for that is because where you're applying that pressure in the muscle in your fingertip, which is located at the bottom of that wall, eventually the more pressure you add, you're gonna stretch that way too thin, and you're just gonna take all that clay off and be left with a coaster attached to the wheel. So when you have a 2, maybe a 3-inch diameter, depending on what you're making, but for now this is just the basics. We're not focused on what we're making just yet. When you have that diameter, pause that position of your finger again and release that pressure. Slowly slide your fingertip up. Again, you want 1 full revolution of the clay, regardless of where your finger is located. So slowly slide your finger up and release that pressure, if you have any or think you have any, so that you straighten out that interior wall. That way your wall is no longer top heavy. It's okay if it gets thicker as it gets closer to the bottom. That's actually beneficial so that everything at the bottom can support the weight above itself. You just don't want the other way around, all right? Now, I'm gonna use my sponge to get all of that water off of my piece, especially out of the inside, because I'm gonna turn my wheel head off to check the thickness of my base, which is also called your foot, before I move forward. And I teach all beginners this until they get into their development where they have learned depth perception and trust their thicknesses. So you want your needle tool for this. So your needle tool looks kind of like a pencil, and you want to hold it as such. You don't need it to be wet to do this, but you want your foot, or yeah, your foot pedal, your wheel speed off. So your heel all the way down to the floor. Now, because you want to check the thickness of your base, you're learning depth perception first and foremost, because looks can be deceiving. It might look thicker than what it is, and it might look thinner than what it is. So to help you develop that depth perception and thickness perception, use your metal needle tool, hold it upside down, and place it all the way through your base, all right? With your finger pointed down, grab a hold of it until your fingertip touches your base. Pull that out, and that's your thickness gauge. For beginners, I always recommend you want to aim for around a 1/2 inch, which is exactly where I'm at. If you're much thicker than that, you can easily repeat the process of opening, but with a little less pressure in your fingertip. So in the center, gently push down until you see a ring of clay form around your fingertip, and then you can gently slide that ring of clay towards your wall, and that will make your base a little bit thinner and give you a little bit more clay to work with, and ultimately more volume in your finished piece. When you have a good thickness, a safe thickness, use your sponge on a low wheel speed and just gently go over that hole You don't need to apply pressure. It'll seal that hole right back up. It'll just smear some mud in there. Now, coming back to your thickness for a second. If you're much thinner than a 1/2 inch, keep in mind when you cut that piece off the wheel, whether you're using a bat or throwing directly on the wheel head, you shave a thin layer of clay off in the process. So if it's too thin, you're gonna tear a hole or really close to it, and likely warp or crack that base when you place it off of the wheel, pick it up, or over time as it dries, it'll start to separate from itself because it's way too thin and you've got a lot of water in that clay. So just keep that in mind. It's better to have it a little bit thicker, and you can always thin it out a little bit later on or while you're throwing if you want it to be a little bit thinner. Now trimming is a whole nother endeavor, which will be a separate video, and that is by refining the thickness and shape of your foot. All right, so I'm going to turn my wheel head back on a slow speed to finish this off. I'm going to reach for water. My knees are still connected to my splash pan. You want to stay at a slow wheel speed from here on out, all right, because you've worked a lot of water into that clay and you're going to stretch it thinner and thinner. So in order to balance that little bit of tension and little bit of pressure that you need to do that, you want to have a slower wheel speed, all right? Otherwise that clay will start getting all floppy and jalopy and collapse on you. So you want to reach for water. You want both hands on the dominant side of your piece. So if you're right-handed like I am, you want your left on the inside, your right on the outside. Just like honing up, your hands are parallel. I recommend that you use the muscles in your fingertip, not the very tip of your fingers, because even if you're like me and you don't have nails at all, your nails can catch very easily on that clay. And the very least, you will scratch a bunch of clay off while you're trying to bring up your walls and remove a lot of clay, more than what's necessary. Or you'll accidentally hook your fingers and push it off center in the process. So I recommend that you learn to use the muscles in your fingertips. If you're lefty, it's going to be the opposite unless you're ambidextrous. All right, so your right hand would be on the inside, your left hand would be on the outside. Just like honing up, your hands are parallel, but your pressure points in your fingertips, not your palms, and it's far less pressure. All right. Now, you want to slowly push out with your left. Now, I like to hold my sponge in my right hand because I know naturally by default I want to use the very tip of my fingertips. And I have learned from my experience that I'm either scratching a bunch of clay off or I accidentally hook my finger. So I hold my sponge in my hand to cover my fingertips, but I can still supply enough pressure to get the response that I need and add water as I need it, so I'm not drying out too much while I do this. You want to slowly push out with your non-dominant hand first to help train it. When you see or feel that clay get a little bit smoother on the side, you want to gently match that little bit of pressure with your dominant hand pushing the clay in. And just like honing up, you slowly slide your hands up and you slowly release that pressure. Now, I believe I forgot to mention this after I opened. After you open, and in between each pull of your walls, which is what I just did, you want to compress your rim to keep it nice and strong because it's front and center and you're more than likely touching it the most, whether you realize it or not. So it's the first place that's going to want to get too thin and either start to tear apart from itself and split, or it's going to buckle, or it's going to just collapse, all right, and fold over. Now, to keep it nice and strong, you want to compress it after opening and in between each pull of my walls. So to do that, you want to make a U with your non-dominant index and thumb and place them on each side of your rim. You're not adding pressure, so you're not pinching that rim. They're just there for support to keep that rim standing upright while your dominant index finger comes in and makes an A with it. It's going to nestle on top and very gently push that rim down until that rim is an even thickness with the clay below itself. It can be slightly thicker, but again, you don't want to end up making it top heavy. and then do another pull of your walls, but with a little less pressure, because you've worked a lot of water into that clay, you just stretched it a little thinner. So every time you touch that clay from here on out, it's more and more sensitive to your touch. So gently push out with your non-dominant hand first to help train it. When you see or feel that clay move into your dominant hand, gently match that little bit of pressure, pushing the clay back in. Slowly lift both hands up. Moving at the same pace as one another, and slowly release that pressure. Don't forget to compress your room. If you change your speed abruptly, or your tension, or especially your pressure, you will have either lumps, like a thicker ring or a thinner ring all the way around your piece because you changed your pressure abruptly or a little too much. Or that piece will start to buckle. It will start to twist. So you want your movement and your transition of pressure very slow and gradual to keep it uniform all the way around. If you want your piece to be straight, so in other words, a straight cylinder, which is the hardest thing to throw on the wheel, you want to have equal amounts of pressure in both hands while you bring up your walls. So not more pressure in one hand or the other. Again, that's if you want it to be straight. If you want your piece to get wider at any point, doesn't have to be the whole thing, you want to have most, if not all of your pressure in your non-dominant hand, because your non-dominant hand is on the inside pushing the clay out. And if you want that piece to get narrower at any point, you can shift gears and have most, if not all of your pressure, which at this point of stretching this clay this thin, it's not much pressure to get a response. But if you want it to get narrower, you want to have all your pressure in your dominant hand, because your dominant hand's on the outside directing that clay in. Now you may be asking, well, if you have most or all of your pressure in one hand and not the other, what's the other hand doing? Awesome question. It's supporting and working in tandem. Even though it's not matching that pressure, you're supporting that clay, all right, to make sure you don't add too much pressure, all right? So it's acting as like a frame or a template or a support system so that clay doesn't cave in on itself. Like a spotter, so to speak. Now, another thing to keep in mind when you're bringing up your walls, especially after your first pull of your walls, you've stretched that clay thin. That clay will get overworked really quick. I am just placing my finger up to this so that you have a good idea of how little pressure it's going to take to get a response out of that clay. Even if I wanted to make that neck much narrower, which I'll do in another video, that's called collaring, if you want to look it up. But the more you stretch that clay, the more it's getting responsive and sensitive to your touch, all right? So just to illustrate that fine groove that's wanting to form right there at the bottom of the neck, you see how my rim's just gently wanting to start to get wobbly? That clay will get overworked really quick, so that's why You want to learn how to be mindful of your water, your speed, your tension, and your pressure, especially at this point. Now, to cut this off, you want to make sure that you don't have water on the inside of your piece, so that your piece either doesn't turn into a mud pie while it's setting up and it collapses in on itself, or cracks while it's drying. I recommend you also use your sponge to gently go over your rim, especially if you want to eat or drink out of your piece later on. That way those edges aren't sharp. You can use your sponge to smooth off any textures that you don't want. It's not going to take pressure in that sponge. Just gently bring it up to the surface. And it'll smooth it out. Now, if I wanted to smooth this out a little bit more, I can use that metal rib by just bringing it up to the surface, and you can gently bend it as well to go over that hump or belly, as well as up to that neck. I don't apply pressure through a tool unless I want to change the shape of my piece. So if I'm just smoothing it out, it's just about bringing that tool up to the surface and holding it firmly so that it doesn't snag my piece and distort the shape and knock it off center in the process. I can also use either of those rib tools, whether it's the metal or the wooden or a polymer one, to shape and compress my rim. But again, at this point, it's just about bringing that tool up to the surface. And then if you want, you can also go back over those edges to soften those. Now, to clean up the bottom before I cut this off, I prefer to use that wooden knife. Hold it like a pencil, so firmly in your hands. I'm going to use the tapered end of the wooden knife because it's got a curved end with two different sides. I could use this if I want to keep a subtle groove or curve at the bottom, but it's not going to completely get rid of that flare. So I'll always start with the taper. I'll hold it like a pencil and align that taper with the wall, because as you can tell, my wall is tapered down towards the foot, towards the wheel head. I'll aim it above that foot and then slowly slide the tip down so that when it meets the wheel head, it cuts that flare of extra clay off. And then I'll hold it so that the taper goes flush with the bat or the wheel head. And I will do that again, align the taper with the wall, slide it back down, and it'll scrape away all those boogers. And I can just keep finessing that until it's nice and smooth. I am working with porcelain, which I don't recommend for beginners. I recommend a fine grit stoneware. Now I'll also use my sponge to clean the bottom of that where I just scraped that flare off. If I want a subtle flare at the bottom, I would not have cut all of that extra clay off. I would have used the very tip to cut just a little bit of it off, and then used that hooked side of the curved end, held it like a knife, and gently brought it up to my foot, and it will gently form and shape a subtle curve. that's not too jagged when I cut it off the wheel. To cut this off the wheel, it is helpful to put a little bit of water with your sponge on the wheel head in the north position, so that when you take your wire tool, you want it to be nice and tight, like dental floss. So if it's obnoxiously long like mine, just wrap it around one or both of your hands. Use your thumbs to plant it in the north position, and as you slide that wire tool up to your piece, it'll scoot a little bit of that water up underneath your piece and help it unglue itself. Now your piece is super wet, it will easily glue itself right back down to the wheel. So I always recommend cleaning that wire tool off and sliding it back up against or up underneath your piece. You don't want to lift until you feel that tension release out from underneath your piece. That way you don't accidentally cut your base at an angle, all right? Dry your hands off on your towel or your apron. You don't want them to be smothered in water or mud, especially if you aren't going to leave your piece on your bat to set up, which I never recommend, so that your bats stay nice and level. You can gently hug your piece with your palms and your fingers and slide it towards you and lift. And then put it on a board, clean off your bat, get another ball of clay, and make another one. I hope you learned a lot. I hope that was helpful for you in any way, regardless of how you prefer to throw. And I also wish you the best with your development on throwing on the potter's wheel. I'll see you next time. Thanks for tuning in.